How's it going? I can't hear you.
I know because I'm muted.
Oh,
Now
there you go. There you go. There you go.
you
Let
get my
me.
video. Okay, good. So everything's working.
Great. So the host is my colleague Terry Iverson, who's not here yet. The seminar is being recorded. We'll chop it up so that this part is not. If that's okay with you, if that is recorded. Yeah. So how's everything?
Everything's good. As you know, we were through some difficult times, but everything's good
Sure.
now. And yeah, I mean, we're in the middle of a snowstorm, which is adding up to the biggest we've had. But you know, it's normal for New England. So
Sure.
let me just get my share screen. Are you allowing me to share the screen?
I think
Yes,
so. I think you should be allowed.
Yeah, seems so. All right, let's do that.
Yeah.
Sure. I don't think I want to have subtitles. Okay.
Yeah. First,
Can you
for some
see
reason.
that right?
Yeah.
Go back to first.
Maybe you should just put instead of doing slideshow, maybe you should do just full screen so that I don't know, because we can see your, for some reason we can see your PowerPoint view, which includes the next slides and your notes. I don't know.
Oh no, you shouldn't be able to see that. No, you
That's right. So just maybe press escape or end slideshow for now.
All right.
At the top.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that.
Yeah, and then maybe just when you go on the PowerPoint, you just go on full screen.
Well, it is on. I think it's on full screen now. Let's see.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's on full screen now. So let's see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Try screen sharing again. Yeah. Perfect. That's exactly. That's perfect. Yes. Absolutely. Wonderful.
Okay. Good. So let me get my laser pointer, and then I guess we're.
That's awesome.
My laser pointer is not pointing. Now it is.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, so whenever you're ready.
Yeah, sure. We'll yeah, we'll give people a few minutes to join in. And so are you teaching this semester?
No, well, I'm technically teaching, but I have no classes, so.
Oh, okay.
I try to arrange it that way because I live an hour and a half from Cambridge, and weather in the fall never has been a problem. Maybe once in 30 years, but never really a problem. But like if I had to go in today, I wouldn't have been able to make it.
Sure.
But since I'm less concerned about this now that Zoom is an alternative. It's certainly not a preferred alternative, but if I had a class today, I would just say, okay, everybody get on Zoom and do it on Zoom.
Yeah.
Are you still doing everything on Zoom or
no, we're in person. We've been in person. I mean, fall 2020, there was a choice whether or not you wanted to be in person. And then starting spring 2021, we've been teaching in person with masks on, and the university still has a mask mandate despite the county not having one. So we go into the classroom, we teach with our N95. We're supposed to use our mask in the hallways. So it's always with me and so on. But
you're doing all your seminars on Zoom though.
Yes, most of them are on Zoom. Yes, some of them are in person. As I told you, like the schedule got pretty packed pretty quickly. Yeah. So I would have loved to have you in person, but maybe for the next book or the next paper,
Book, I don't know, but certainly not
but,
a 10-year project.
This one is a monster. I'm trying to go through it. I told you, like, pretty slowly, unfortunately, because time is always limited. I'm enjoying it a lot. I really like the first 5 chapters. I'm on chapter 7 right now. I'm still digesting chapter 6, which is kind of the bulk of the book.
Well, it's a big part of it. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
kind of innovation of the book. The rest is kind of commentary, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the history of thought part. It's really, I agree with everything you write, basically.
Oh, good.
It's no, my recollection. I mean, I completely agree with you that the Modigliani thing was needless, and Clower, for that matter, was a needless detour.
Well, Clower was trying to do something different, I think. I mean, I think he was on the cusp of something, and I think the interesting thing about that interlude is there are a lot of people that kind of were trying to work out something different, and then people kind of lost interest because there was the counter-revolution and Lucas and all that, and just nobody was going to pursue this. So
yeah.
But it's almost always the case. If you go back, you can always find some precursor and some predecessor.
Oh, sure.
And, things that I thought were original, when I went back, I found, and other people have pointed out that they had this idea too a long time ago and even wrote it in print, and I just didn't know about it. But
yeah,
I mean, one of the things which you haven't got to yet is in the theory of interest. I make an argument that what Keynes really had was a theory of spreads and not a theory of the level of interest rates. And it turns out that Dennis Robertson, who was earlier a collaborator, but then became a critic, but he corresponded as they did in Cambridge in those days. There was, everything was exchanging mail, not emails.
Yeah,
since they had
letters.
Delivery 3 times a day, I think, it was practically instantaneous. So he sent a long letter to Keynes with a lot of criticisms of the general theory the year before it was published. This is all in Keynes's collected papers. Keynes responded to this, but never responded to what was actually, to me, the key point that Robertson made, which was namely that the theory that Keynes had come up with was a theory of spreads. And, it's puzzled me, and I'm sure there's no solution to the puzzle, because it just kind of dropped there, because Robertson, clearly was dissatisfied with the liquidity preference theory and voiced his criticism, but he never had the cogent criticism that he had in this letter to Keynes of 1935. So anyway, yeah.
That is interesting. Yeah. As you know, as I'm a student of Duncan Foley, so there's a long echo of Jim Tobin in me, right? And so that's kind of, even though I don't work on these things, but so I don't know, Duncan is still a big fan of Q for some reason, even though it doesn't seem to hold. It's speaking on the other side, right? Like the investment behavior, right? This idea, that the investment is kind of autonomous. So yeah.
Well, I have something to say about Q. I have something to say about Q theory too, and in fact, I've been exchanging emails with Randy Ray.
Oh yeah, okay.
And he wrote there's been a roundtable in the Just Money blog. I don't know if you're familiar with that blog, but it's run by a law school professor at Harvard, Chris DeSanne, who wrote
oh, okay.
A really good book on money, history of money. Anyway, Randy contributed to this, and he criticized me for making light or not taking as the center of Keynes chapter 17 of the general theory, which I found, like a lot of people, incomprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he made me go back to it, and what I've come to conclude is that this is really an attempt to state Q theory.
Okay. The state of long-term expectations, is that what you mean, right?
No. This stuff about own rates of interest.
Oh yeah, that's impossible. Yes, I agree with that.
Chapter.
Yeah.
But that as I read it for the nth time, it seemed to me it was really groping towards a Q theory, and obviously not very clearly, but that's what I think it was doing. Anyway, yeah, I guess we won't go into that today, but
yeah, sure. Now, this is all fascinating. In the meantime, people are coming in. There's a lot of graduate students that are joining us, but I also see my colleague Edward Barbier. He's there. So hopefully, I'll just take a few more minutes to give time to people to come in, and then we'll get started, I guess.
Yeah, I have a pact. I'm trying to do this, and trying to leave a little time at the end for discussion. But I'm glad to stay a few minutes later if
sure, absolutely.
People want to stay and talk. I mean, I won't go over the time in the presentation, but
awesome.
Stephen, it's great. This is Ed Barbier. It's great to have you come and do this seminar. Thanks very much. I've been.
I wish I could be there in person.
Yeah, that would have been great, but this is the best we can do. But I've been following your work since I was a master's student, and so I appreciate everything you've been doing over the years. So I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you very much. Well, this is different from my last efforts. So.
All right, so I see Steve Schulman is here, also, professor in our department. Ray Miller. I see Rama Vasudevan also. I see Joe Barbier, and a lot of. So this is like a good packed house. 24 so far. More are coming in. I'll just wait one more minute and then I'll get started so that we make good time.
Ready whenever.
Yep. Anders Fremsted right there.
Yeah, I have only because I've got the the screen. I can only see you and Edward, and I see somebody at the bottom, but only half, I think, her head.
20. Oh wow, even more people are coming in. 27. That's good. Good attendance.
Are there people from outside CSU, or is it just limited to the?
I don't think we shared the link with anybody outside, but that might be just my own understanding. I don't know. All right. Well, I think I'm going to get started since it's already 12:02. Welcome, everybody. It's my great honor to introduce Stephen Marglin, the Walter Barker Professor of Economics at Harvard University. He has had a long career, starting with being the enfant prodige of optimal control theory applied to a variety of problems, including social discounting and dual economy. But then he turned more toward the dark side, maybe not the dark side, but the radical political economics and post-Keynesian economics. He wrote some very important articles, such as his very famous "What Do Bosses Do?" or the papers with Amit Bhadouri on profit squeeze and Keynesian theory, for example. And today he will be presenting this massive tome on raising Keynes, which I am reading very slowly. So I'll just turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniele. I want to say something about the title, which I thought was a recognizable pun that everybody would get. And just to be clear, it means literally conjuring up Cain, the biblical Cain. But what it means colloquially is making trouble, as honey, the kids are raising Cain and you better do something about it. I always understood that for people for whom English was a second language, this might prove difficulty, but it turns out to be worse than that, because I found from my students, they didn't have a clue what the pun meant. And so I've concluded it's a generational thing. And that's just the way it is. Barry Eichengreen picked up on it because he said the book had a lot of good things, but it one terrible pun. So anyway, so I want to start by saying, and I don't know if I'm speaking to this group or not, but if you ever studied or taught mainstream macro, that everything that you taught or learned in that course about the determination of employment and output is at best half right. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to set the record straight. And apposite here is a quote from the preface to the general theory that the problem is not the new ideas. They're not really that complicated. The problem is getting out of the old modes of thought. And I think that's a very profound observation on Keynes's part. 900 pages, more or less, as Daniele said. But if you're looking for a book that tells you anything about the life of one of the most fascinating 20th century figures, and certainly I would say the most fascinating economist of the 20th century, this isn't the book for you. But fortunately, there are good alternatives. A recent one now, I guess 2 years old, is Zach Carter's The Price of Peace, which is a, well, it's not short. I think it's 500 more or less pages. The sort of go-to classic biography of Keynes is Robert Skidelsky's 3-volume work. Each of those volumes is, I think, about 1,000 pages. So that tells you something about the richness of Keynes's life. One more just brief digression, and that is my pilgrimage to Bloomsbury and the house that Keynes owned that housed the so-called Bloomsbury Circle, named after the area of London, which it is. You can see it there. That's the house. And here's a close-up and the plaque there. And there I am, having made my pilgrimage. So I guess the first question is, why is a book necessary to 85 years after the publication of the general theory? I mean, there's been plenty of time to digest the general theory. It's been criticized and explained from various points of view. Why yet another book? To answer that question, I'm going to do just a very brief review, and this is summarizing the first several chapters of the book, first 4 chapters, I guess. The rise, fall, and resurrection of the general theory. So the rise was meteoric. At least among the younger generation when it appeared in the 1930s. Not so much, in fact, that's an exaggeration, not so much. Very little among the older generation, who pretty much dismissed it as being wrong, and to the extent it was not wrong, simply an unnecessary emendation of things that everybody knew. I recount an experience that actually I wouldn't say, well, it was in a sense the trigger for the book, so it's probably worth recounting it. I mentioned this at the beginning of the book. I came back from teaching an alternative EC10, an alternative introduction to economics course. I came back to the building where the economics department is housed at Harvard on September 15th, the day that Lehman Brothers fell. I overheard, I kind of eavesdropped on this conversation that was taking place in the foyer. A whole bunch of people, I have to confess, many of them I didn't know. I think they were, virtually everybody was younger than me. And of course, that's par for the course. Almost everybody in my department is younger than me. But they were debating whether this financial collapse was going to have any impact on the so-called real economy. And I listened, and opinions were divided. I think it's fair to say that the center of gravity of opinion, the weight of opinion was, no, it wasn't going to have any impact. It would, or if whatever impact it had was going to be short-lived, because, you know, what was the real economy was functioning. There was production was taking place, income was being generated. Why should the fall of even a major financial institution change that in any fundamental long-term way? And my takeaway from that, overhearing that conversation, was that Keynes's moment had returned, and there was room for a new statement of Keynes. And so I thought this would be like a couple of years. I thought I knew what I wanted to say. I had actually taught a course on Keynes for a few years at the turn of the century, and basically given it up for lack of interest, to tell you the truth. So I thought, you know, it'll take me maybe a year or two to get my thoughts together and write them down, and that would be a good project to do. Well, it took me 2 years to figure out how little I knew. And then the next several years to learn, and then several years to put it into a shape where I could put it before the public. I'm not sure I totally succeeded in that, but anyway, that was my introduction to Keynes, or my introduction to this book. So let's go back to what I would call the threefold aim of the general theory. There was, first of all, and this was never far from Keynes's mind, his desire to impact policy and to change people's attitudes towards policy. He realized that to do this, he had to change the theory. And he realized beyond that to change the theory, he had to change economic method. So he had this threefold aim in the general theory. The policy innovation was to understand the limits of monetary policy and the necessity of fiscal policy. As is well known, he didn't have much to say about fiscal policy, but clearly he had this vague statement about the socialization of investment, and it clearly meant that the government was going to manage the volume of investment, but it wasn't clear how this was going to be done and what else this entailed. So the statement that is as well known from Keynes, one of the ones most frequently quoted, is that the government, if it were to employ people to dig ditches and fill them up again, there wouldn't be anything to show for it, but that would be better than doing nothing. And in effect, it would prime the pump and stimulate business. I hope there's some people who are raising their eyebrows, if not their hands, because this isn't quite what Keynes said, actually. This is a quote from Jacob Viner, a critic of Keynes, and it's a quote from actually 1933, 3 years before the publication of the General Theory. Note the date. The point I'm trying to make here, by the way, here is Keynes's statement, which if you read it is a little bit different, but really it's basically the same point. But it brings me to my second point, which is that Keynes understood that if he wanted to change policy, he had to change the theory, because while people like Viner were calling for the same policy he was calling for, it was totally ad hoc. It didn't come out of any theory, it just came out of their common sense as observers of the economic scene and being able to transcend basically the orthodoxy of their times, rather than this policy prescription that Viner and Keynes shared, coming out of a consistent theoretical picture of the economy. Viner didn't have the theory, and unless you're a historian of economic thought, you probably have never heard of it. You may not have even heard of Viner, but I wager you would not know this paper of Viner's in which he made this, offered this policy recommendation. So Keynes's theory, so Keynes recognized the importance of theory and of changing the theory if he were to get his policy message across. And he puts forward a new framework that articulates the intrinsic failure of the invisible hand. That is, the intrinsic failure of a capitalist economy to be self-regulating, specifically to be able to provide jobs for willing workers. And the key innovation of Keynes's theory is his insistence on a key role for aggregate demand. Now, Keynes was very clear that this was not in place of aggregate supply or in place of supply, but in addition. So that was the theoretical innovation, it was important for Keynes, and I have followed him in this, that the framework be the framework of perfect competition. Now, why would anybody in the 1930s in the UK or the United States or in Europe or anywhere for that matter insist on framing the argument in terms of perfect competition? It is something of a puzzle, but I think there's an easy answer because Keynes provided the answer himself. If he was going to convince his fellow economists of his theory, it was necessary to frame it in terms of perfect competition, because the theory always allowed that if there was monopoly, if there were trade unions, if there was, God forbid, a government that actually supported people with a social safety net, that would screw up the competitive mechanism. And so it's not surprising that these same orthodox folks would call for the if not the total abandonment of the social safety net, and it was of course quite rudimentary in that day, at least its attenuation, that the same people thought that trade unions were anathema, etc., and that the way to restore prosperity was to make the world resemble the model of perfect competition. So what Keynes felt he had to do, and I think rightly, was to show that even in a model of perfect competition, if you understand that model correctly and you work it out correctly, as he tried to do and as he in the general theory, that it does not lead to the beneficence of the invisible hand, that it leads instead to a system in which it will only be by fortuitous coincidence, when the stars are all aligned, that economy will generate full employment. That a capitalist economy left to its own devices, perfect competition and all that, is not self-regulating. As he wrote in a piece a year or so before the publication of the general theory, he actually began as a radio talk on the BBC, and then appeared in the Listener, and then in the US in the New Republic. His motto was, attack them in their citadel. If we don't attack orthodoxy in its citadel of perfect competition, we will not be able to convince the profession that there's something rotten in the state of orthodox economics. By the way, if there are questions or clarification, please interrupt. And Daniele, can you moderate that for me so I don't have to try to keep track of it? Yes, you have a question with clarification.
We'll do. No, we'll moderate.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right, so the third leg of this three-legged stool was a revolution in method. Keynes argued, again in the preface, that in contrast with his earlier book, The Treatise on Money, that this book, The General Theory, has to be a study of the forces which determine changes in employment and output. Alas, Keynes was unable to deliver on the third piece of this, on the methodological change that was required. And this I do not intend as any criticism whatsoever. Nobody in economics in those days, in the 1930s, had the necessary tools. They were just coming into use in physics, and the profession did not possess the tools needed for this methodological revolution. The surprising feature, therefore, or the surprising thing, is not that Keynes didn't have the tools, but that the next generation, which surely had them, the generation of Hicks and Samuelson, Tobin, et cetera, who did have these tools, never mobilized them to the end that I try to do in raising Keynes. Daniele and I were chatting a little bit before, and it's interesting to me. I think there were clearly, and I try to say something about them briefly in an appendix to chapter 6. There were attempts in the 60s and into the 70s of, tentative forays into a dynamic understanding of the arguments of the general theory. But they never really took off. And by the 1970s, it's clear why. People just lost interest in that. The center of gravity of economics has shifted radically. It was the era of Lucas and rational expectations and all that followed that. And all these attempts just kind of fell by the wayside. Oh, wait, I think I skipped a slide. Yeah. So what Keynes fell back on, and not only Keynes, but his critics, both the friendly ones and the unfriendly ones, was comparative statics. Now, comparative statics is a great tool. I use it all the time, and I have nothing against it, except that it doesn't work for the questions at hand. And I'll get into the argument a little more detail. I mean, the book gets into the argument in great detail, but I will say a little more about it momentarily. But the comparative statics framework simply doesn't work for the questions that, in my judgment, for the questions that Keynes was trying to address. And I would say that, well, I'll come to this, but the next chapter is the fall of Keynes. And the fall of Keynes was almost as rapid as the rise. Not quite, but almost as rapid. And there were really, I would argue, three elements in this. And I talk about two of them briefly and one of them at some length in Raising Keynes. These are politics, the economy, what was going on in the economy, and the development of economics as a discipline. So the politics is interesting. Keynes was, the 1940s, the 1950s. This was the age of McCarthy, witch hunts, Red Scare, and this showed up in economics. And Keynes was denounced. Here's one instance of it: a group of Harvard alumni who wanted to purge the economics department of the baleful influence of Keynes. Here is a quote from that gives you the flavor of Keynes at Harvard. Not just Harvard, the young Buckley, William F. Buckley Jr., who became I suppose, the patron of the New Right, wrote a book, God and Man at Yale, a good part of which was spent denouncing the corruption of the young by the teachings of Keynes at his university. Interestingly, I just came across a discussion of why the French translation of the general theory appeared only in 1943. There were translations of Keynes into German, actually, during the Nazi period, immediately, and other languages. And in French, it was only in 1943, and partly they had got the translation ready, it turns out, by 1939, but then the war broke out, there were problems with getting paper, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, France was occupied by Germany, and there was a collaborationist government. And it was the collaborationist government, it was not the Germans, who objected to the publication of Keynes' general theory on the grounds that this was communist propaganda. So that's very different from the argument that was made by anti-Keynesians on the political front at Harvard or Yale or all over the country, that Keynes was a useful idiot for the communist conspiracy masterminded in the Kremlin. That raised an interesting question, which I will not go into, but I just will signal for you a book to read if you want to hear the case that Keynes actually was a socialist. I don't agree with this case, but Jim Crotty makes a good argument, I think, for the argument. I mean, Keynes was certainly a critic of wild capitalism, but I would not, and he did use at one point the term to describe himself as being a liberal socialist. But I take this with a grain of salt. Anyway, it's an interesting question. And as I say, Jim Crotty makes as good a case, I think, as you can for the argument that Keynes actually was a socialist, but he was certainly not in any sense an agent of international communism. The economy, that's the second piece of the story of the fall. And that piece really has mostly to do with the stagflation in the 1970s, something I'll return to later. again, very briefly, everything is brief today. And if you want more, as Daniele said, you've got 900 pages that you can find more in. The stagflation of the 1970s, interestingly, I think the failure was not Keynes's failure, but the failure of his disciples who didn't follow Keynes in the sense that, as I said earlier, Keynes meant aggregate demand, I think, very clearly to be understood in addition with supply and not as the sole mover of the economy. But in some of the kind of more naive renderings of Keynes by his disciples in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the focus became totally on aggregate demand with no attention to supply. And that came back to bite people in the 1970s when supply became actually a limiting factor and very crucial to understanding what was going on. As I say, I'll come back to this the end of my presentation today. So third, and the part of this that I'm most concerned with, and this occupies most of chapters 3 and 4 of Raising Keynes, there are 20 chapters. Keynes made an assumption of fixed money wages, which he's very clear about. He intends this as scaffolding. This is not meant to be a description of the actual economy, but it makes it simpler to be able to tell his story if he assumes rigid money wages. As scaffolding, he discards it after 18 chapters, and chapter 19 talks about what happens when money wages change. Unfortunately, chapter 19 is a weak chapter in the sense that it doesn't even come up to the standards of modeling that prevail in the rest of the book. And when I say that, again, I don't really mean any criticism of Keynes. He was using models, I think, in a very intelligent way to get his ideas across, but he was not using models as we understand models today and have for, half a century anyway, as these formal structures that are supposed to incorporate everything that is relevant. For Keynes, it was a model was a way of clarifying ideas. He deploys models, and I think very successfully in this regard, but when he gets to chapter 19, he doesn't have a model, even to organize his thoughts as he does in the first 18 chapters. So he tells a bunch of stories, and they're all important stories and they're interesting stories, but I think they were easy to dismiss because they did not add up to a formal model. And indeed, the criticisms that were leveled, as I said earlier, were all leveled in terms of comparative statics. Why doesn't that work? Why doesn't comparative statics work? Well, the primary focus of the empirical focus, not the theoretical focus, the empirical focus was, of course, the Great Depression. How did this depression happen, and why was it so long and enduring, and why didn't market forces restore equilibrium? Well, both, as I say, Keynes himself and his critics used comparative statics in order to tell this story. Well, what is comparative statics? Well, comparative statics, if you want to talk about changing prices and changing wages, a comparative statics model will be basically a comparison between two different planets, planet A and planet B. Planet A has a wage at $20 an hour. Planet B has a wage of $15 an hour. And then you look at the difference between the equilibria in those two, on those two planets. The important thing here is that while the wages and then the consequence prices and everything else may differ on the two planets, the only change is via interplanetary travel. When you go from planet A to planet B, you see something else. But in planet A, there's no change. It's the way it is. It's been $20 an hour today. It's $20 an hour tomorrow. It was $20 an hour yesterday. It doesn't change. In planet B, it's $15. Again, it doesn't change. Whereas in the Great Depression, the problem was precisely that prices and wages were changing. It's most dramatic in the United States in agricultural prices, but not limited to agriculture. Farmers in the United States, and you have to remember that in the 1930s, the agricultural sector was a big part of the economy, producing 15% of the output and employing 25% of the total labor force, whereas now it's 2% or something like that. So the change in prices meant that farmers who had taken loans, and this is critical, who had taken loans when wheat was $1.25 a bushel, now had to pay back these loans when wheat was 38 cents a bushel. So they had to produce 3 times as much wheat in order to be able to repay the loan. Similarly for other agricultural commodities. So none of that is captured in a comparative statics framework. So it's necessary to, if you want to make the argument about change, to do it not in a comparative statics framework, but in an actual dynamic framework which can model the process of change. So that's basically my enterprise in the first half of the general theory. And I'm going to just try to convey a little bit of the flavor of that. And again, I hope I'm going to convey enough of it to tantalize you to go out and actually read the book. So we start from what is a common diagram that you'll see in virtually every undergraduate text and captures thinking in the way mainstream thinks about the determination of employment, output, and real wages. So there's a supply of labor schedule. There's a demand for labor, but let's be clear, the demand for labor comes simply from profit maximization. This is a competitive model. So each firm is trying to maximize its profits. We're in the short run now, so capital stock is fixed, and that is given when the marginal productivity of labor is equal to the real wage. And then you get an equilibrium, which is not only full employment. Every point on the supply of labor schedule is full employment in the sense that there's a job for every willing worker at that particular wage. But in addition, point E is a capitalist equilibrium, if you will. It's a profit maximizing equilibrium. And that determines the equilibrium for the economy as a whole. Now, I do this in a slightly different space, and I won't try to justify that now, but it's exactly equivalent. Instead of working with the real wage, I find it more convenient to work with a real price, which is simply the inverse of the real wage, and replace employment on the horizontal axis by output, real output. But the same argument, supply of labor schedule is now downward sloping in this space because we've shifted the vertical axis. Supply of goods schedule is the same as the demand for labor schedule, but it's now to be understood as a case where the real marginal cost is equal to the real price. But it's the same schedule, it's just presented in a different space. So here is the mainstream equilibrium. I won't say it's in every elementary text, but it's certainly in the standard ones that I've looked at. Mankew's text, the leading text, I think, for sales. If you want a liberal text, go to Baumol, Blinder, and Solo, and it's the same diagram. Of course, what Keynes adds to this mixture, or to this diagram, is an aggregate demand schedule, which is given by the equality of spending with income, or desired savings equal to desired investment. Now, I present that as vertical here. It's the simplest possible case with the interest rate is given, but the book is 900 pages. I don't stop with this. This is the starting point, and go into more sophisticated versions of aggregate demand. But this is enough for now to see what the problem is, namely that you now have 3 schedules, 2 degrees of freedom, and the system is overdetermined. You have this equilibrium, which is the mainstream orthodox equilibrium. But if you ignore the supply of labor, as Keynes does for 18 chapters, you have this equilibrium, which takes account only of aggregate demand and profit maximization. In my formulation, what you have from this diagram is that any point in the green space is actually a possible equilibrium depending on the adjustment process that you postulate for output, prices, and wages when you're not in equilibrium. There are clearly multiple equilibria. There's a whole space of equilibria. And you can't even specify what the equilibrium is until you specify some dynamic process for how prices, wages, and output change. One possibility, and I don't argue this is the only possibility, but one possibility is an equilibrium like E, where, and that's a perfectly plausible equilibrium. And it's an equilibrium, let's be clear, in the sense that output and employment are stationary. There's nothing in the system which will move output and employment. And the real price, and of course the real wage, are stationary as well. But, and here's the critical point, neither the numerator nor the denominator is stationary. Rather, at a point like this, like at E, price exceeds marginal cost. So it's in the interests of producers to sell more, and they try to sell more by lowering nominal prices. There's unemployment. You're at some distance from the supply of labor schedule. So there's unemployment, and therefore money wages are falling. But it's an equilibrium because money wages and money prices are falling at the same rate. So that's the sense in which it's an equilibrium. It's clearly not an equilibrium in terms of market clearing. Markets aren't clearing at all. But it's an equilibrium in the sense that, if you will, of equal frustration. In the labor market, wages are going down because of unemployment, but the attempt of that market to reduce wages is frustrated by the fact that producers are lowering prices at the same time because that's the way they think they can sell more goods. So producers and workers are equally frustrated at this equilibrium, and it's an equilibrium because the forces are in balance. So that's the gravamen of the first part of the book, and then this part of the book is concluded by an empirical chapter which takes off from the point that actually this is what happened in the Great Depression. Prices and wages fell, and there was nothing in the system which was going to bring them back. And what brought them back was a change in regime. What brought them back was the election of Franklin Roosevelt in the United States. Other countries had different experiences, but in all cases, it was a matter of a change in regime that brought about the recovery, attenuated as it was for several years. And it was nothing in the system itself, in market forces, which restored that, which restored anything like full employment. We'll just stop here briefly. I've got a little more to do. I think I can get through it pretty quickly, but let me stop here for questions and clarification, and then I'll try to tell you a little bit about what's in the rest of the book, and hopefully we'll have at least a few minutes at the end for you to ask me substantive questions or make substantive comments.
So I would like to open it up to people to ask questions if they have some. I have a couple, but I'll wait. Ed.
So Stephen, thanks. That was excellent. So essentially, what you're saying is that when Roosevelt was elected, essentially his policies, which were to boost aggregate demand, i.e., shift it in your simple diagram to the left, is what got us back going.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't have any. I think pretty clear. He didn't have any fixed idea of what was going to do that. But what he said was, I'll try one thing, and if that doesn't work, I'll try something else. And he was, of course, appalled by the budget deficit. But as they recognized in his administration, it was that or even more calamity. And so he was willing to take the budget, to live with a budget deficit as the lesser of evils, not embracing this as Abba Lerner would do a decade later. But yes, that's exactly right. The point was. So
if you don't mind, Stephen, I have two follow-on questions very quickly from that. The first was, do you know to what extent Keynes's general theory had influenced and how it influenced Roosevelt to make that decision? Because that's quite a leap, because those days balanced budgets were sacrosanct, as you point out. And the second was, this was during the period of the gold standard and when trade wasn't quite as globalized as we have now. And maybe I'll get to this later, but the shifting in 1970s to the dollar standard and away from the fixed exchange rate, plus in the 80s the complete liberalization of capital movements around the world. To what extent does that change anything? The second question may be out there. It's something worth talking about later, but certainly the first one, I'd appreciate your insights as to how he was influenced in this way, Roosevelt, to make this dramatic change.
Let's put off the second one. I have to say, I don't really have much to say about that. I don't think it's an essential issue as far as the theoretical level, and At some point I had to stop, it's 900 pages.
Yep.
I had to stop. Anyway, the first question is, I think the answer is Roosevelt was not, nor was his administration, very much influenced by Keynes for some time. It was only with the recession of 37, 38 that Keynes's ideas had begun to seep in and affect some of the people in his administration. And some of these ideas, at least as far as their policy application, were being developed by others as well, who were more involved in administration policies. But it was a delayed effect, and partly because, of course, the general theory didn't come out till 1936. There's a story of a meeting between Keynes and Roosevelt, I think in 34, I think in 34, but I may be off by a year, in which it was apparently a meeting of mutual incomprehension. Roosevelt said afterwards that, I thought this guy was an economist. He seems to be a mathematician. And I think while Keynes admired Roosevelt's willingness to experiment and to try new ideas, I don't think that Keynes came away from that meeting with a great admiration for Roosevelt's economic understanding. So let me just say a little bit about the rest of the book, and then hopefully we can come back to some of these questions which you might have to pose to me, or comments you might wish to make. So this next part of the book, chapters 9 to 13, are what I call building blocks. And this is a revisiting of some of the basic arguments and assumptions of the general theory in the light of what I would regard as the important criticisms. I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but the important criticisms that were made in the intervening years. In the first chapter of this set, chapter 9, necessarily addresses the permanent income hypothesis, the life cycle hypothesis, and what that implied. And my takeaway from that is that basically different strokes for different folks, that there is a part of the population, I don't know what the percentage is, maybe it's 15%, maybe it's 25%, I don't know, for whom permanent income life cycle modeling has a certain plausibility. That's the best I could say. For the 75% of the population who basically live paycheck to paycheck, maybe not literally, but it makes no sense at all. They just don't think this way. And then there's the 1%. And it's very interesting, but this 1%, of course, does a lot of the saving. So it's not like they just count for 1% of what we're interested in, which is saving investment dynamics. But nobody has a clue as to what determines their saving behavior or their consumption behavior. I don't. It's certainly not life cycle hypothesis. I mean, if you're a billionaire, I mean, you could really try to spend money, but you're never going to succeed over your lifetime. So, what is it that's motivating? Nobody knows. So I take this as a good reason for a kind of class-based approach, and what we have now are fairly primitive versions of that, but basically Koletsky, Kaldor, Robinson, Pazinetti, this line of argument that thinks of the determination of saving in terms of class. So that's takeaway from that chapter. Investment, I think I have one thing important new to say, and that is the importance of the distinction between capital widening and capital deepening. It's not a new distinction, of course. But the thing about it is that virtually all the growth model theorizing is done in terms of capital widening. Whereas capital deepening has a very different impact and a very different motivation. In fact, it's the opposite, I would argue, namely that higher real prices stimulate capital widening, but lower real prices, that is higher real wages, stimulate capital deepening. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because as you move in the business cycle, you're moving in a boom from a regime in which capital widening is going to be important. And you go to a slump, capital widening basically disappears. There's no reason to to expand the capital stock for producing more in a situation where there's so much excess capacity. So it matters for a lot, and it matters in particular. Danielle referred to the work I did with Amit Bhadouri now 30 years ago. But that argument, I think, can be sharpened considerably by paying attention to this capital deepening, capital widening distinction. Interest. So this was Keynes's great innovation, and it really was a great innovation to argue, instead of the orthodox theory of the determination of interest rates by investment and saving, productivity and thrift, that interest rates are determined in financial markets for financial assets. That's the key innovation. And by the way, this is not 1930s, this is 2020. If you pick up any orthodox text, mainstream text, it's still productivity and thrift, okay? Still investment and saving. And I have some really choice quotes from both from Ben Bernanke and Larry Summers, putting that orthodox position forward. And what I said, well, Ben Bernanke would have had a much easier time as chair of the Fed if his theory had been right, but he was wrong and Keynes was right. Keynes goes wrong though, and this is an important point. In thinking of his theory as a theory of levels of interest rates. I see we're coming to the end. I'm not doing as well as I thought I was. You may have to bear with me for a minute afterwards.
We'll stay a bit longer.
No, it's not just. Keynes thought he had a theory of the level of interest rates. What he had instead, I argue, is a theory of spreads, theory of interest rate differences. Does that matter? Well, it depends what the context is. In the context of policy, it doesn't really matter because that's what central banks have done for at least 100 years. They have provided the anchor to that spread in terms of fixing the short-term interest rate. It matters in the theoretical sense of Keynes's theoretical question of, does a capitalist economy left to itself, is it self-regulating? And so it does matter in that context, and I go into that in some length. I'm going to skip over to the long-run model. And then this is what I'm going to end with. So up to now, it's all been kind of short run, but Keynes was not limited to the short run, and I think his arguments apply to the long run as well. And that, of course, is a fundamental departure from orthodoxy, because there's a whole literature, you could say it's the center of gravity of macroeconomics today, of so-called new Keynesian models, in which the argument is basically short-term. Now, you can dispute this, and I'm in a dispute right now, a friendly dispute, about the extent to which that's true, but that would be my argument, that basically these models say that shocks are going to be transitory. The model will always return to, or the world will always return to full employment, etc., in the long run, and that aggregate demand doesn't matter in the long run. I think that's the message both of elementary texts, and it's the overall message of, I think, the new Keynesian dispensation. Where I think that a whole argument goes wrong is in treating the labor force as exogenous and treating, therefore, the supply side as exogenous, and that in reality, in the long run, the labor force is endogenous. The labor force available to the capitalist economy is endogenous. And this is raising Marx rather than raising Keynes, because the basic idea here is reserve armies and various reserve armies, which are constituted and deployed as needed. So in the US, we have seen the gradual incorporation of people from agriculture into the capitalist economy. As that reserve army kind of dried out, and not coincidentally, I would say women were incorporated into the paid labor force. Not they didn't work before, but they are now in the capitalist labor force. And when all else fails, there's always immigration. So all these are different reserve armies which are deployed as needed. And I conclude from a model in which labor supply is considered to be endogenous, that first of all, and most important perhaps, is that the Phillips curve is alive and well. Aggregate demand matters in the long run as well as in the short run. I developed the idea of, that's in the Maduri Marglin work, that high wages may or may not be good for capitalism, and I developed that in the context of, particularly of the influence of capital deepening versus capital widening, and therefore whether you're in a slump or in a boom. And I want to conclude coming back to something I mentioned earlier, the stagflation of the 1970s, and what I would regard as the premature death of the Phillips curve. And here on the first slide you're going to see, as I think probably familiar, this is the heyday of the Phillips curve, 50s and 60s, and boy, doesn't that look like just a beautiful relationship between employment and inflation. And you all know what happens, that very soon after that, things kind of go a little bit haywire. And then you have, go further, you have this configuration. Well, this is interpreted by, in the counter-revolution, this is a quote from Robert Lucas, as the death of the Phillips curve. As he puts it, Friedman and Phillips made a forecast to the effect that a high inflation decade should not have less unemployment on average than a low inflation decade. And he says, talking about the 70s, we got the high inflation decade, and with it, as clear-cut and experimental discrimination as macroeconomics is ever likely to see. And he concludes that I think Friedman and Phillips were right. It's really as simple as that. Well, technically, yes, Phillips and Friedman were right. Come back to this diagram. This is the high inflation decade. And indeed, there is more unemployment, not less. But it's not as simple as that. You still have a Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is shifted because of the supply shocks. And I argue there are two kinds, actually. There's a wage shock and then the oil shock. But you still have a Phillips curve. You still have this trade-off and continues into the Volcker era. Volcker really pinches the economy and he gets a lot of unemployment. He drives down inflation, but it's a trade-off. I think the death knell of the Phillips curve was decidedly premature. Let me stop with that and thank you. And my just one concluding comment. And where are we at now in economics and in the economy? But I'm going to focus on economics. The argument I'd like to make is that just as in Keynes's day, economics and politics go together. Keynes's economics, a little bit late, but nevertheless, supported the New Deal, and the New Deal supported Keynesian economics. Social democracy in Europe played the same role. Also true on the right, Milton Friedman and other right-wing theorists, Lucas, etc. On the one hand, and Reagan, Thatcher on the other, symbiosis. Question is, are we at a point of a new symbiosis and a new progressive politics? I don't really like the word progressive, but it'll have to do. And a new economics. I don't think we'll know for some time, but this is my attempt, Raising Keynes is my attempt to contribute to that alliance. So thank you. I apologize for going over, but I'm happy to stay a little bit longer if people have some questions or comments they'd like to make. So Danielle, the ball's in your court.
Thank you very much. I want to give the opportunity to folks in the audience to ask their questions before asking mine.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the screen sharing so I can see more people. You can go back to it if you need be.
I see Rama that is burning with a question. So even before she raised her hand, you're muted still. Oh, okay. There you go.
I'd love to hear to hear more of your thoughts on the Phillips curve, especially, it's alive and well, but it's had a really kind of bumpy ride.
Yeah.
It was vertical and now it's getting flat. So what does that tell us about, in terms of the current conjuncture, what insights do we draw from Keynes or from Marx for basically not the rise and fall of the Phillips curve, but its changing slope?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. And my observations are not different from others in the sense that my observations show it's got flatter. I'm not sure what conclusions to draw from that. It's only in the last few years that we've been running a very hot economy. I've been following, like everybody else, the debate about whether the current inflation is demand-driven or supply-driven. I tend to believe that it's more supply-driven, but I also believe, and I argue this, that there is an inherent trade-off. If you're going to push the economy and run it hot, there is a trade-off with price stability. And the price of a hot economy is some inflation. I think one of the things I would do differently in this book, I think I was a little bit cavalier in my discussion of inflation and its dangers, problems, or lack thereof, in this book. I don't have much to say about it. I have certainly a little more to say about it now, and that is, I think I would emphasize more the conflicts within the working class about inflation. If you are one of the people who wouldn't have a job were it not for the economy running hot, or if you are one of the people whose wage gains depend on the economy running hot, then I think it's pretty clear where your interests lie with regard to this trade-off. If, on the other hand, you are insulated as a worker or salaried person, if you're insulated from the whether the economy runs hot or not, if you have a secure job, or if you are a retired fireman, teacher, police person, you are likely in this economy going to suffer from inflation. Our cost of living adjustments for municipal state workers are most states woefully inadequate. So there's a conflict even in on Main Street about inflation versus price stability. Of course, the elephant in the room is Wall Street, and Wall Street's interests are very clear, and they don't make any bones about it. And they have, of course, the ear of central banks all over the world. Their interest is in price stability. So, the 1% holds the bulk of fixed income securities, and those folks have taken a hit, which they've done well on the whole, but in terms of their holdings of bonds, they've certainly taken a hit in the last year. So, that's my take on the current situation and what this analysis has to offer about that.
Ed, thank you.
Thanks again, Stephen. I mean, when I was a young development economist before environment resource economics, I was influenced quite a lot by your dualism work. And then when I switched to natural resource economics, your control theory work helped, because in natural resource economics, we now treat nature and natural resource assets as a form of capital, which aren't fixed. But I really want to ask a question. Your last comments to Rama actually are the ones that I wanted to come in, is that you made that excellent point that towards the end about how that the permanent income hypothesis doesn't apply to 75% of the workers, but it also doesn't apply to the 1%. Yet they're the ones who are driving certainly the policy bent towards price, emphasizing price stability. But they also drive savings. And I'm going to go back to my question that I had to you earlier on, is that with the financial flows being so internationalized now, and given the fact that if there's a difference in interest rates or rates of return on fixed assets between two different countries, capital will just flow in instants. How does that change everything? I mean, it's a very different world we're dealing with now than even in the 1970s, and particularly with the growing wealth inequality, not just income, wealth inequality, where the richest 1% depends so much of their income and the wealth is held in financial assets. That's a big deal that I don't think macroeconomics is taking into account at all.
I think you're probably right, and I can't say that I take that into account. I think that's probably volume 2. And I don't
look forward to that.
I don't know. Well, I don't know if I'm going to write volume 2, but I consider this this is a contribution, and I hope people will build on it. And that's certainly one dimension and direction in which I I can see, as you do, the need for a lot more work. So I hope I've got a foundation, but I don't claim to be able to or have done the building.
I'll jump in. A couple of comments. So number one, about your point about the endogeneity of the labor force. I think that we're actually seeing that right now, right? Like, as you said, like, since we've been running the economy hot for the last few years, and wages have been funny rising, especially at the bottom of the income distribution. And I'm talking about nominal wages in this case, because real wages is debatable whether they're rising. We're seeing like kind of a 1% point jump in labor force participation, right, compared to where it was before. So it's something that we need to grapple with. It's not just like this exogenous growth rate of the labor force that it's a constraint on the economy at all times. I think this is something to keep in mind. There are some modeling complications that I'm not going to get into it, because it's not easy to see whether or not you can always have endogenously growing labor force. But I think we're seeing in the transition something like this as unfolding right now, because the labor market has been running hot for a few years. I wanted to ask you a couple questions. One is a small one, and the answer is probably very quick. When you started talking about rational expectations, right? And you talked about it like very briefly. It seems to me that between the lines, what you were saying is that they remove dynamics by assumption. Basically, this is a point that actually Kenneth Judd has been making quite forcefully, right? That the rational expectation model consistency, what it does, it forces the system to coordinate on the equilibrium right away, and therefore it removes basically. So I see you nodding, so that's probably the answer.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. I say that. I think it's in chapter 5 or 6. I don't remember now, but I do say that somewhere. Just what you're saying. That exactly that it and the assumptions that you would need. I've told a little story about this, very brief. I once had lunch with a colleague that I will not name, very nice guy, and he was interested in my project. He's a macroeconomist, and he asked me, he said, so I was telling him a little bit about my project. This was several years ago. And he said, well, what's your imperfection? As if, you had to have some imperfection. Otherwise, we all knew, he thought, that the system without imperfections would always go to full employment, et cetera, et cetera. I thought about that for a while. I didn't have a quick answer for him, but I thought about it much later, and I actually say this at the end of the book. The answer, the imperfection is people. And what do I mean by that? That people don't have these calculating abilities that rational expectations assumes they have, and they can't get to the equilibrium right away. In fact, what I argue is that people don't even know where the equilibrium is. They discover it in the process of adjusting. But yeah, I completely agree with your point.
I really appreciate this. There's exactly. So I had a kind of a follow-up, but you touched upon this adjustment process, which is something that I'm grappling with as I was telling you. Like, I read chapter 6, which is I went very slowly on it, but because of the equilibrium indeterminacy, which I like as a concept. I think it's like fully Keynesian in the sense that even the simple Keynesian cross, like in the Samuelson formulation, there's no notion of potential output, right? So in principle, the economy can coordinate at any point on the 45-degree line, right, which is basically equilibrium indeterminacy. But the question is, right, in real life, in the real world, we see economies coordinating, like either on recessions or booms, right? So this is where I struggle with the indeterminacy that you have in the book. This is where I struggle with the triangle, in other words, because if economies can produce expansions and booms, and we are not able to discriminate that from the equilibrium conditions of our model because it's overdetermined, are we back to general theory as being depression economics, as it's been labeled, like, back, early on? So
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, that's it.
Oh, okay. No, the fact that it's theoretically indeterminate, there is some process in the world, and I think there are some clues. This would be getting ahead of the story, but I think there are some clues in the empirical data as to what the process actually is. And while it's not theoretically determinate, this story, which is just one possible story, but the story that I certainly learned more than half a century ago, that it is that excess demand or excess supply drives output, not prices, immediately, that's actually the right story. And that prices respond because producers then are calculating their profits, et cetera, but that the immediate impact is on output. Well, that already narrows down the indeterminacy. So I think my argument is what we need is more of the spirit of anthropology in economics to really understand what the processes are. And I don't claim for a moment that the simple processes that I use to illustrate my story are that they're correct or exhaustive or anything. They're just illustrative. And what we need is some people like Truman Bewley, who actually tried to study, well, how are wages set and who sets them and on what basis and so forth. And, that's of course very second class in economics because we're trying to be a science like physics, not we in this group, but we in the profession. And anthropology is, that's not science, that's just interpretation. So I think we need more interpretation, more anthropology, and that is the way to narrow down the indeterminacy, which is there in theory.
Incidentally, this is for people in the audience. This point that Steve made about quantity adjustments instead of price adjustment, in chapter 5 of the book, there's this beautiful distinction between Marshallian versus Walrasian adjustment. And it's actually there's a I think for those of you who didn't read the book or are thinking about buying it, that's probably so far it's my favorite part, like the distinction between the two and how Keynes actually reasoned in terms of Marshallian price adjustments when he actually, would have been much better off reasoning in terms of Walrasian quantity adjustments at given equilibrium prices. And I thought that was very, very well done. I have one more maybe.
Let me just add that he was brought up, of course, he was a student of Marshall, so what would you expect? But the interesting thing is, I don't know how many of you have ever wondered when you looked at your first economics diagram and you had price on the vertical axis and quantity, on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. And then you went back to your high school calculus and algebra and geometry. And that's not the way it was at all. You always had the independent variable on the horizontal axis and the dependent variable on the vertical axis. So why does economics turn that around? Well, my answer is, it's not definitive, but it's my answer, is that we use Marshall's diagram. And for Marshall, quantity was the independent variable, but our theory is Walrasian, in which price is the independent variable and quantity is the dependent variable. So that's just an aside. Go ahead, Danielle.
So this is the last thing I'm going to ask before either leaving it to everybody or just letting you go. So I in the talk, when at some point you started talking about dynamic adjustments, right, which were not available to Keynes as a tool, and therefore they lead to this basically sort of stripped down version that is probably easy to misunderstand and whatnot. And I think when you made the remark about wages and prices moving right along the adjustment during the Great Depression, what made me think is that this is, it can be either interpreted as transitional dynamics from one equilibrium to the next, if we follow, say, Samuelson's correspondence principle, right? Or, right, it can be interpreted as, so there's some accounting that needs to hold in the economy as a whole at each period, whenever you file your taxes or whenever you write your books. But for this accounting to hold, you might have, during the Great Depression or during the Great Recession, like firms and households going bankrupt, right? Like these kind of things. And so I wonder how you see it.
I see it just as you said. It's not just a transition, because there's a lot of dead bodies on the way. The businesses, the farmers in particular, that go bankrupt. And there's no symmetry in this, that the people who are doing better because their assets are appreciating, their financial assets are appreciating as prices go down, they don't offset the bankruptcies and all that, that means for the system. So moreover, it's not just a transition a la Samuelson, because there's no end to it unless you change the regime. There's nothing self-correcting in my argument that says that this is going to stop. And in fact, the curious thing about this is people noticed, Habeler, great critic of Keynes, noticed, Laurie Klein noticed that you could, in theory, have an equilibrium with prices and wages falling, but they dismissed it because they said, well, that can't be, that can't go on. But the point is, yes, it can't go on, but it's not that it can't go on because of something internal to the system. It can't go on because people won't tolerate it. And if you don't get Roosevelt, you get Hitler. I don't want to end on that, especially with all that's going on.
Oh my gosh. Any more questions from the audience before we close the seminar?
People want to get their lunch.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. So hand clapping. Well, so maybe this is a good time to end. Even with the Hitler final remark. But what can we do? I really want to thank you so much, Steve, for talking to us. It's been very stimulating. It's a good start of the weekend. Thanks everybody for coming in, and until the next time.
I welcome your thank you for coming, and I don't know if it's a good start for the weekend, because I don't know, not Colorado.
Yeah, no, probably not.
But in any case, I welcome correspondence. Very easy to get in touch. smarglin@harvard.edu, and I'd be glad to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Take it easy.
Bye, Ed. Thank you.
Take care, Steve.